thank you so much, Jonathan, for joining us today. Well, let me tell you what's happening in Vegas headlines first, and then we can get into the report. So most recently, people have been talking about the CES convention, the Consumer Electronics Show, and a lot of companies like Microsoft and I think Google or some of these big tech names are pulling out from that convention. It's like the largest technology convention in the world. It's like a huge thing.
I was actually in Las Vegas a couple years ago during CES
Oh, yeah.
for an unrelated reason. But Ryan and Ed Barone, the founders of RentRedi, were there at the same time. And I have a close friendship with Ryan Barone. So I got to see him there while he was representing RentRedi. And that's obviously what came back to the report.
Yes. Good intro. Look at
Yeah,
that.
I'm learning.
Now let's talk about the report. So first of all, congratulations on publishing this report and welcome back to the podcast. This is your second time as being a guest speaker on the show. So thank you so much, Jonathan, for joining us today.
That's right. And thank you so much for having me back.
Thank you. So let's start off with an intro and talk about Chandan Economics. What is this report about? And what is so special about this report compared to other reports that were published by like other associations?
Sure. So Chandan Economics is a commercial real estate economic research consultancy. We typically work with institutional clients, running back-end research, litigation support, you name it. As far as the report is the Independent Landlord Rental Performance report, and it really focuses in on that, that mom and pop do-it-yourself end of the market that is, really non-institutional. And this kind of differs from the existing data and reporting on the market that is primarily tracked by the National MultiFamily Housing Council, NMHC. They have a fantastic data set of more than 11 million units in their sample, but it's all focused on the professionally managed side of the market. So this is more of the do-it-yourself mom and pop. And what we see is there's a pretty large performance difference between those two groups, especially during the pandemic when there was a lot of distress. We did see some marginal bits of distress in the NMHC data going back last year, but more or less it seemed pretty steady as it goes, even during the late spring, early summer 2020. However, within our data set, we see that performance rates really did take a hit during those periods where presumably renters by necessity were having a much more difficult time making ends meet. And that's really reflected inside the rental collection rates for these do-it-yourself properties.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I saw that on the report that majority of the market share of single family rentals are managed and owned by mom and pop individual investors instead of institutional owners. And there are a lot of institutional capitals looking and deploying capital into this sector in commercial real estate. So would you like to touch on like the market share of individual owners versus institutional and the potential growth of this sector within commercial real estate, and why are so many institutional investors are looking at single family rental?
Sure, I'm happy to touch on that. Well, first, that data that you're talking about is based on the Census Bureau's Rental Housing Finance Survey. It's done every 3 years. I think the last one was 2018, which is the data in the report, and it's reported on a little more than a year lag. So we didn't get that 2018 survey results until 2019. So it's not great for tracking real-time updates to the market because right now we do see that the single family market is becoming a lot more institutionalized, but it does give us a pretty good sense of where it was a couple of years ago and kind of assessing across. We do see that the majority are indeed these independent landlords. I think it's somewhere north of 70%. But I think it's also important to reflect that within multifamily, even if within going up to 50 units, I believe, it's about 35% or so that are in this independent owner, non-incorporated individual investor. I guess that's the phraseology that they use. But then there's also a significant share that are LLPs, LPs, or LLCs. So these are really, they're more than likely to be mom and pop owners, but not necessarily professional institutional grade. So even within multifamily, we get the sense because of the headlines are all driven by institutional players, right?
Mhm.
But if you break down the data, the vast majority of landlords are indeed a lot smaller in scale. But it's much easier for us to find stories and track stories of the one landlord or one real estate group that has a bunch of units instead of a bunch of landlords and a bunch of smaller companies operating the same amount of units. So there's a reason that we were able to focus our attention to the headlines to those larger players. But I think what that data does is, give a good sense of the spectrum of ownership. And then within single family rentals specifically, why is the case that we're now seeing a jump in institutional attention is really because of the, 20, 30 years ago, it was really hard for there to be scale here. If I am a single owner, it makes a whole lot more sense for me to have all of my units in one place. I don't need to go between unit to unit. I have the shared resources within that property that are shared between the units themselves. It's much more of an efficient process. What's happened over the last number of years, especially with the integration of property management softwares, much like RentRedi, who our current data partner for the report is, it's really made it the operation side for the landlord within single family rentals look a lot more like what it does in multifamily. So if I see all my units in a singular aggregated place on an app, and I'm able to operate it as if I'm operating a multifamily property, as long as there is some premium to compensate for the extra costs of having extra systems across the properties. So, different HVAC systems, et cetera, then it makes sense for me to consider single family rentals versus multifamily. And the other thing that's really driving the single family market is the economics of the starter homes. Again, 20, 30 years ago, from my parents' generation, they're about, if they wanted to go and move out to the suburbs, there really wasn't this amenitized single family rental option available to them. There was a much greater set of optionality for these starter homes, ones that are smaller down payment and much more easy to transition from if you don't have later in life balance sheet, so to speak. What we've seen over the last 10, 15 years or so is that it doesn't really make as much sense for developers to be building those smaller units. There are much higher margins on the more expensive, larger unit side of the market. And SFR has really kind of come in and satisfied a need. What we've noticed is that a lot of these families that are starting to have children, they have a predisposition to wanting a suburban life. They want the amenities of those quality public schools, but they don't necessarily want to own. They might have a preference for owning, but if they had to have the option of owning in an urban environment that doesn't have these family forming amenities that I'm looking for versus renting a suburban environment that does have these family forming amenities that I'm looking for, it seems like there's been a shift to prefer, option two there. So those two things in tandem are really kind of supporting the underlying tailwind for the single family rental sector.
Great, thank you. And you touched on a very good point about the demographic of the renters. I know in the report, there's a section that says who are the single family renters versus the 2 to 4 units renter versus the small multifamily renters. And there's the income level difference, the number of kids they have, and also the collection rate and turnover rate. Would you like to touch on that, single family renters versus multifamily renters?
Sure. I mean, that's not necessarily the data that we used with RentRedi. That's actually pulled from the 2019 American Community Survey, which is done by the Census Bureau. We kind of just included that to the average renter in each one of these units and how that might be causally related to some of the collection trends that we're seeing. We did notice that within single family rentals, you have a larger household income, and you also saw a higher amount of children per household versus the small multifamily or the 2 to 4 family units. This is kind of expected. Very often might move out to suburbs if you are expecting children or if you have a recent newborn and want to begin that lifestyle, as well as we have a higher likelihood of having, two income earners in the house, a joined household instead of a single person household where there might be less income. So I think both those factors really, drive up the two statistics that we include, being the average number of children and the average household income. What was interesting in the most recent couple of months of data was the higher collection rates within single family rentals, which I think that there is a degree of it's entirely possible that those data are connected, where, hey, these are households that have higher means because they are more likely to have two income earners in the household and they have more disposable income. So they might have a little bit more of ability to, successfully meet those monthly obligations.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Great. And do you want to touch on the pandemic trend and the current trend of single family rental?
Sure. So I really think that's actually the most, interesting thing about these data. Going back to the NMHC discussion before, what we try to do is create an apples to apples comparison in the intro of saying, okay, what is the full collection rate that they have for the month, every single month, and compare our full collection rate for each month and say, what is considered to be normal, and then where do we see a degree of divergence. So pre-pandemic, these professional operators were collecting at X and we were 3.5% below X. So collection rates were 3.5 percentage points lower in independently operated units compared to professionally operated units. If you start to look at, once the distress started to happen in spring and summer last year, I believe it's in August of 2020, where we see the greatest spread between the NMHC data and the RentRedi data. I think it widens out to about 12.5 percentage points difference between the two. So that's really kind of indicating that there was a large degree of distress that was experienced for these smaller operators, than the professional set of the market. And this is largely expected. If you were a household of greater means, you were also more likely to be in a job that was more easy to transition to work from home and more likely to maintain your income through that distress. I think it's Opportunity Tracker. It's a research product launched by Harvard University. What they look at is the employment levels by income group. And if you looked back over as recently as this summer, I think that's where their data ends. But if you looked at high wage earners, they were double-digit more jobs right now than there was pre-pandemic. If you looked at middle wage jobs, more now than there was pre-pandemic. If you look at low wage jobs, they are still far behind, and in some cases seeing deterioration in the number of jobs that are out there for these low income workers or people that are actually in the workforce. So as far as total number of jobs by income group, we are far below where we were pre-pandemic for this group. So if we consider not only renters having less household income than owners, but then renters who are renters by necessity having less income than renters by lifestyle, and thinking that we are more likely to get a larger portion of renters by necessity in our sample, where it's, hey, probably further a little away from the urban core. These are a little more dispersed units, probably at lower rental points. We do think that we have a more renter by necessity group. This is definitely a group that was more likely to be impacted by job losses during the shutdown. And we kind of really see that within the performance rates. And going into the most recent data, we are seeing that while we're in a markedly different place than we were last summer, where we were seeing collection rates, on-time collection rates in the 60s, we're now at around 77.6% for the December's preliminary data. We have seen that start to come down a little bit over the last number of months. I think as of December's preliminary data, the on-time collection rate has dipped in the last 4 months. So it really does kind of signal that, despite the macroeconomic recovery, with the new variants and with slowing job progress, there still definitely is a portion of the economy as well as the rental economy that is continuing to struggle. And I think that these data kind of speak to that.
And what about the geographic locations and like gateway cities versus non-gateway cities, Sunbelt states versus non-Sunbelt states?
Sure. So speaking specifically to the Sun Belt, that was actually some of the more surprising data that we found in our report. I think in the last 2 months of data, Sun Belt underperformed the rest of the market as far as on-time collection rates. And this it partially confused us at first. And then we started to look around and tried to make sense of this. Last week, I was looking at Yardi Matrix's report. And what was really kind of striking to me was within a lot of these Sunbelt markets, they are leading as far as year over year rent growth, but both within the not just the rent or by lifestyle, which they break out, where we're seeing double-digit annual growth rates for rent, but also in the renter by necessity. And these renters by necessities in these Sunbelt markets, they were renters by necessity before we had these high levels of price growth. So in many ways, they're kind of being squeezed by the incoming demand that is, resetting fundamentals. So it kind of paints a picture that there is, some cost to growth.
Yeah, I would like to comment on that about the Las Vegas market. Year to year rent increase is 20% in the Vegas market. And I attended an event hosted by a luxury multifamily developer here in town, and their property manager told me that over 40% of their renters in these luxury units are remote workers who moved in from California. So they are e-commerce or remote work, but because they live in Las Vegas, which is lower cost of living, and they pay no state income tax because now they're in Nevada. What has been squeezing in the rent growth condition of our economies are the local renters, people who live and work in Las Vegas. And majority of the workers in our economy are in the hospitality, entertainment, and gaming sector, and local wages are not increasing. What pushed up the rent growth in Las Vegas are the Californian who moved into the valley. They either rent luxury units or they buy a lot of the new homes here in town. So that's what I'm seeing in our local market.
No, 100%. I think that, what you guys are experiencing in Las Vegas is not all too dissimilar from what the gateway markets were experiencing over the last 5-6 years, where we still had high levels of domestic immigration, and there was a lot of attention being brought to workforce renters. Can the firefighters, the police men and women, can they afford to live in those communities that they are serving? And that's something that we've struggled with. And I think more attention is now being placed into these affordable markets. These affordable Sunbelt markets are viewed as affordable from everyone coming in with San Francisco and New York salaries. If you compared the average salary of the average worker in a place like Las Vegas, Nashville, to the cost of living there, it was probably a little bit more calibrated in a similar way to how the cost of living versus the incomes are here in New York. So you have renters coming in from these high cost areas. They are seeing a improvement in their personal affordability, but it is not coming without a cost. And I think what you heard from that developer and what we're seeing a little bit in our data, it's at least partially anecdotal at this point. Between hearing that from that developer and our data is still very new and we're trying to get our hands around it. But I think this is probably the start of a story, not the end of one.
Right. And not just for rental units, single family for sale units in the Vegas market are very hot. Are very hot too. And this is the first time I've ever seen something happen like this in the Vegas market, where you have to go through a lottery in order to buy a home
Mhm.
here because there are not enough for sale units available for the huge demand that we're seeing from all of these Californians moving into the valley. So when you go check out a home model of a new community, and you have to put your name and your contact information and enter yourself into a lottery. And then the home developer will draw the lottery, and whoever is picked from the lottery, they will call you, and you have to make a cash offer that day when they call you. They have no time to look at your loan improvement or other things. You have to make a cash offer that day. Otherwise, they have thousands of people, waiting in line to get a house here in Las Vegas. So that's what we're seeing in the Vegas market.
I'll be honest, I'm at a loss for words. This is the first time I'm hearing of this. The only time that I've ever heard anything like this has been I was listening to an economist podcast who was talking about either Shanghai or Beijing, and they have a similar kind of lottery system. Can you send me anything that you have on this within Las Vegas?
Yeah.
Because that's incredible.
Yeah, I can send you a lot of news articles about the Vegas market. And any new listings on the market, the day that an existing home, the new listing
Mhm.
comes out, they will get a dozen or 2 dozen offers that day. And it's mostly all cash offers. And these realtors will only consider cash offers because they just don't have time to waste, because there are
Yeah.
so many people waiting in line to buy a home in Vegas. And a lot of these buyers are Californians who sold their, older house, smaller house in California, and now they have money to buy a brand new, bigger house in the Vegas market that's much cheaper
Yep.
here too. So yeah. All right. How are the data collected for this report? Would you like to touch on that, please?
Sure. So the data are possible thanks to our partnership with RentRedi, which is a property management software. We get our data by seeing their backend and seeing rental payments by unit. Currently, they have about 50,000 units on their platform. And as part of our active rent tracker sample, we have 20,000 units that we're looking at on a month-to-month basis.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, for joining us today. And thank you so much to all of your team members for providing this report. And we have to give a shout out to our friend Dylan as well.
Yeah, I think we have to give a shout out to to everyone at the RentRedi and Chandan Economics team. I think Dylan Zito and Jason Davis on our team would be impossible to have done this process without them, both from the data collection, the statistical methods that went into creating the models, the production of the report, the marketing. Everything has kind of been a learning process on our side. And without the two of them, this would have been a much bigger lift than it already was. Our founder, Sam Shandon, he is our guiding light in the market. And again, this would have been impossible without his input and without his guidance. And especially the team over at RentRedi. So that is Ryan Barone and Ed Barone, leading their team over there. Without the good data that goes into this report, we wouldn't have too much interesting stuff to talk about. So I think this report does a really good job of bringing forward a segment of the market that is not represented very much in other data samples. Mm-hmm. And it allows us to tell really interesting stories about where there is distress and where there's health or the lack thereof it across the U.S. rental housing sector. So we view these data as incredibly interesting, and without them, none of this quite literally would have been possible. So it's been a team effort across teams.
Yes. And before we finish this episode, could you please tell the audience how can they check out this report? Which website do they go to download this report?
Sure thing. You can find it right at Chandan.com. That is CHANDAN.com. Right there at the landing page for you to find yourself to the report.
Yeah. And please also follow Chandan Economics on LinkedIn and Instagram.
Please.
I'm your social media fan. Every time when you guys post something, I click the like button and then we share it.
You're always our best booster. I'll tell you that, Minja. You really are.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jonathan, for coming today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. Bye, guys.
Bye.